This is my first podcast.
Your first podcast ever?
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. But what we're trying to do is just take some time to kind of spend a little more in-depth conversation about different various topics, especially ones that are interesting or significant or think would be relevant to the entire congregation. Somebody says, "Hey, let's talk about this," and Shaun, it's almost been a couple months now, but said, "Hey, we need to talk a little more in depth about the Lord's Supper." So. Yeah. I was really excited, and so Shaun said, "Hey," I said, "Shaun, I got this idea to do a podcast. Do you want to be our first podcast episode or episodes, depending on how long this lasts?" And he said, "Sure." So one of the things we'll do with these podcasts is also get to know some other DCCers a little bit more. So I was going to this is Shaun, and I want to just ask a little bit, introduce yourself, introduce your kind of faith background, maybe even your professional background a little bit, and what kind of drives you to continue to want to dive deeper into subjects like the Lord's Supper, that kind of thing?
Okay. I'm Shaun McKinley. I'm a preacher's kid. My dad was a non-denominational Christian minister for his career.
PKs for the win.
That's it. So I grew up in the church, and basically I grew up under King James. Everything was King James. So, understanding...
Lots of THs on the end of words.
Yes, and trying to understand what it's saying when you're using ancient English, and then, you can't... It's the only approved version, and then, the NIV, when it came out, it was acceptable, But I'm very technical. I'm very logical by nature. I mean, I was an electronics tech in the Air Force for half my career, and the other half of my career as a federal agent. Yeah. So I'm a trained investigator, and a lot of that is I don't make assumptions. I take all the data and put it together and see what the picture is. I don't try and make a picture out of the data I find.
Yeah.
So when you go through and you see things in the Bible. And you go, a lot of people just take it, okay, the Bible says that, and they just go with it, and I can't do that. I go, this says, like my issue with, Good Friday, it says 3 days. You don't get from Friday to Sunday, you don't get 3 days. And I'm like, I struggle with that my whole life. Yep. And then, I finally...
Just a little background. Yeah. So Shaun and I have had some fun conversations about this, because the 3 days and 3 nights predicted for Jesus would be, dead and buried 3 days and 3 nights. Shaun prefers a very literal take on that, where, so he would not say Good Friday, he would go like Good Thursday. And so I would say, I take a little more figurative in the way that the Jews use the words, but it doesn't actually make a huge difference in doctrine. But no. I love but that's the kind of thing you get like kind of, you want to know this technical, and let's make this work in logical sense.
Yeah, I mean, in my mind, how can you believe the Bible if it doesn't work in all situations? Mm-hmm. So until I can get that figured out, then it just eats at my brain. Mm-hmm. And that's one of the things, like with the Last Supper. Yeah. The way it's presented never made sense. Okay. Right? So they're at the Passover meal, and it says, "You eat my body," and you're like, we don't do that. And drink my blood, and you definitely don't do that. Yes. Those are prescribed in the Old Testament. That just never made sense. And we just, people accept it. And a lot of people just don't think of, they don't go into that deep, but it was just bugging me. And I had to dig into it till I understood it. Yeah. So that's what drove me to, I get a problem in my brain, and until I sort it out, I just can't let go of it. Right.
One of the things I love about the Bible is, and this is something we've been talking about a lot over the last couple of years here at DCC, just because my own brain has started connecting dots it never did before. Right. But the Bible is, to use a very modern term, is hyperlinked text. Every time, so when Jesus says, "This is the blood of the covenant," for example, right. Matthew 26, 27, 28, where you're there, every Jewish hearer would hear that word, and they would automatically, their minds would link it back to some other text, which we'll talk about today. Right. And so it is this beautiful thing, and so you have to see it as a whole. You have to look at it as a whole. You have to see those connections and those graphs and those that kind of intertextuality.
Right. So, if you take it in the 21st century in modern English, it makes no sense. Mm-hmm. You have to understand where it came from and how it was originally written, and the culture it was written in. Absolutely. To understand it. So. Yep.
All right. So let's talk about it. Where are we starting today?
Okay, well, I started with just the bread and the cup.
Okay.
And then I realized when I got into it, it's more than that. It's the Passover.
Yes.
So when you
They're
look,
at the, because just for clarity,
they're at the Passover.
They're at the Passover feast when Jesus institutes the Lord's Supper.
Right. So, and then what really ties that in is just before the Passover, the chief priests wanted to kill Jesus. They're trying to set him up.
Yep.
But they said, not during the feast, because they didn't want an uprising. But God's timing was the Passover, so it didn't matter if the chief priest wanted to do it after, when everybody'd gone away.
Right.
They wanted to do it then. So I mean, that is another point of this. The Passover is relevant. It's not just coincidental that it happened at the Passover.
Absolutely.
The Passover was pointing to the crucifixion.
Well, and I think that's one of those things. Anytime you go, oh, that's a nice coincidence with the Bible, you're probably thinking about it not quite right.
Not quite right.
Not quite right. Okay, yeah, good call. I think it is 100%. Absolutely. Especially, I don't know what gospel we're going to start in, but Matthew's gospel is this kind of beautiful thing we see over and over again, that Jesus is, in many ways, we're seeing all the typology from the Old Testament come in. He's the new Moses, right? He's the new Exodus himself. He's the new temple himself. He's the new, he's actually the new Israel in and of himself. He's like the Israel in one person. We were talking in our Tuesday night Bible study. What we found really interesting is the 3 temptations that Jesus goes through when he's tempted by the devil at the beginning of his ministry correlate to temptations that the Israelites had in the wilderness that they failed miserably. But Jesus doesn't fail, so he's Israel as he should have been. And what's really amazing is when he quotes scripture in the face of those temptations, they're all from the wilderness wandering passages, which is really cool because he's, again, living out that. And where is he when he's tempted? In the wilderness. And so this idea that Jesus is kind of living out intentionally in these moments, living out the life of Israel, but the life of Israel as it should have been, as God desired it to be, the perfect, the one perfect, is absolutely 100%. And so when we see him, offer the Lord's Supper at Passover, obviously that's huge.
Yep. So, I mean, I just went through looking at, Matthew 26, basically starting in 17, where he's looking for the place to have the Passover and everything's setting up for the Passover. And they go through, and then during the Passover, he institutes the Lord's Supper with the bread. But looking at that, you have to go all the way back to Exodus to look at when God instituted the Passover.
Yes.
And the parallels there. So you go back to Exodus 12, right? That verse 1. The Lord said to Moses and Aaron, in the land of Egypt, this month shall be for you the beginning of the months, right? So this is the start of their year.
Right.
And they tell all the congregation in Israel, on the 10th day of the month, every man shall take a lamb according to their house, a lamb for the household. So they have to select a lamb. And when you bring that forward to Christ on Palm Sunday, there was a crowd there, right? And it's like, okay, he goes in, there's a crowd in there. And nobody was, why is there a crowd there? The crowd was there to select their lamb.
Oh, it was lamb selection Sunday.
The lamb selection Sunday. Yeah. So that's why they were there. And he went and they, Hosanna, King of the Jews.
Blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord.
They selected him while they were selecting their lamb. So
we see that, not even realizing what they were doing, obviously. Yeah.
Right. So that parallel. So on Palm Sunday, the crowd is there. It's not a normal crowd. They're there to select their lamb. Right. And he came in and they selected him. Yeah. So then, then you go from the 10th, and then you select a male without blemish and all of that. And then they're to take it and keep it until the 14th day. Right? So they've got this lamb for 14 days, and the point of that was to examine it, make sure it had no blemish, make sure it was healthy, it was good for sacrifice. Yeah. Well, when you look at Jesus, the week of the Passion Week, between Sunday and his crucifixion, he was tested. the Pharisees were asking him all the questions. They were examining him, and they found no fault in him. They went to Pilate, and everybody examined him and found no fault.
Right. We were just talking about, like in the text we read Sunday, it was, they finally asked their last question of Jesus, and Jesus turns around and asks them a question, like, whose son is Messiah? And then that whole passage ends with, and they stopped asking him questions from that day forward.
Right.
At that point, they knew they weren't going to get him to say something to implicate himself. They were just going to have to force it in there.
Right.
Yeah.
So that was the examination period, and that follows the Passion Week, right? So just in line with the Passover, they select their lamb, they examine the lamb, and then they slaughter the lamb.
Yeah. So they select, examine, and slaughter. Oh, I love that. That's exactly that's exactly what happens in Passion Week.
Right. So they select him on Sunday. The next couple of days, they examine him. Everybody's asking him questions.
There's no blemish or fault, like the lamb.
They even bring him to Pilate. Pilate, I find no fault with this man.
Yes. Yep. So that's cool.
Yeah. Like so it's all lined up, and then the Passover supper. Right, they go and they actually have their Passover lamb. Right, and after supper, he goes out to the garden and he's arrested.
Right.
It's still because of the Jewish day, which starts at dark.
Yeah, 6 p.m.
Right.
Yeah,
so
about.
Right. So that's at dark. They're to select their lamb. They're to slaughter their lamb, roast their lamb, eat their lamb, and it's got to be gone before morning.
Before morning. Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
So they have their meal. After the meal, they go out to the garden. He's arrested. He's tried. He's convicted. The next day is still the same day in the Jewish calendar. And he's crucified.
Right.
So the same day they're supposed to slaughter the lamb, he's crucified.
Right.
And I always wondered why we had 3 hours of darkness, but he's crucified and it goes dark, which is when they're supposed to slaughter the lamb, at dark.
Oh, yeah, but it would, yeah.
I never understood that. Then I was like, wait a minute.
Yeah.
The timing, they're, at dark, they're supposed to slaughter their lamb.
Right.
Well, he's crucified and God takes away the light and it goes dark.
Yes.
So it's just like, all these, when you go back and look at the Passover and bring it forward and look at the crucifixion, it's like, oh, all these little things, why does it matter what time you slaughter them?
Yeah.
It's sometime during the day. We don't, whenever. But no, that was the deal. And, I mean, they didn't do it in Egypt.
Right.
Because it was, we're getting out of town.
Well, yeah,
But when they the first one they set it up, and it was just, do it and get rid of it. But when they instituted a continuing Passover, it was to be done at a place God selected. And then, what is in Hezekiah, I think it was, he selected Jerusalem as a place to slaughter the lamb, which is where Christ was crucified.
Right, which is amazingly interesting because if you go even back before Exodus, you go to the story of Abraham and Isaac, and they go where? To Mount Horeb, which is Mount Zion, which is where Jerusalem was built. We find that, even pre-Exodus, we have God on Mount of Jerusalem is saying, hey, I will provide the lamb for sacrifices as a man goes to offer his one and only son. Like, it's all, we start talking about these intertextual links and hyperlinks and connections all throughout it. But
this is where it's offered. This is where it's done.
Yeah, so I love, so Exodus 12 is kind of, it's so good and crazy because we got this really weird thing where God is instituting something that he knows is going to be all the way forward. It's going to be something that's continued on. But and so they're like, okay, we're starting something new. It's a new month. We're gonna have our whole calendar based around all of these ideas and that kind of thing. But it was right in the middle of the plagues, right? Like this is right before the final plague on Egypt is instituted, and so they don't even know. He even says, like, you shall observe the feast of unleavened bread. We don't have a feast of unleavened bread yet. When he says that in Exodus 12. And so it's like God, like we see all this foreshadowing of what's about to come when God institutes the law and shows them all the feasts and the calendars and all of that kind of stuff. Yeah, that's wonderful.
And I like when they tell you that they were to slaughter the lamb and catch its blood in the bowl.
Yeah.
Then they were to take the hyssop and to mark the door.
Yeah.
So that
this is Exodus 12, verse 22.
Right. So the angel of death would pass them over.
Right.
Right. Well, and of course, I got this ingrained because I saw the Ten Commandments, when I was a kid.
Right. With Charlton Heston.
Right? So where Joshua's going around, he's painting the doors, right? Mm-hmm. So I always see this when I read that. I see him taking
like a paintbrush,
and he paints the doors.
Yeah.
But when you read anywhere else in the Old Testament, when they use a hyssop to sprinkle the blood, they sprinkle it or they touch it. Right.
Yeah, that's what because it's more like it's like a plant.
It's a plant. Yeah, it's a branch of a plant. They're taking the leaves and they're
right. It's not a paintbrush with bristles. Yeah,
they're touching, and every place else it's to touch it or to sprinkle with it. Right. Mm-hmm. And I saw one of these sites when I was doing my research. If you think about how they would do that on the lintel and the posts,
so like the lintel would be
the lintel's across the top and the post, right? So you're supposed to touch all three. Mm-hmm. Well, if you do the lintel and you do the sides, your spatter pattern kind of looks like a cross on the door.
Oh, that's kind of cool. Yeah. Yeah, so you're basically making a cross almost right on the door.
Yeah. When you sprinkle blood on the lintel and you sprinkle it on the post, if you're not painting it like...
Well, that's a cool visual, too.
It is, yeah.
I mean...
I don't know if it's biblical.
No, but it's a cool imagery thought for sure. Thousands of years before Roman crucifixion was a thing.
Right.
Yeah, that's amazing.
Yeah, but I never thought about that because
because the same thing happens when they get to Mount Sinai and God kind of delivers the Ten Commandments through Moses, and the people say everything the Lord has said that we'll obey, and so they enter into the covenant with God, right? And so they offer the sacrifice at the bottom of the mountain, and they catch half of it in a bowl to put on the altar.
Right.
But then the other half, Moses takes and he uses hyssop and he sprinkles it on the people.
Yeah.
And one of the cool things I was sharing with Shaun before we actually turned the camera on was same exact language. It's Exodus. I actually have it right here. It's Exodus chapter 24, verse 8, and it says, Moses took the blood and threw it on the people and said, behold, the blood of the covenant of the Lord, or that the Lord has made with you in accordance with these words, which is the same exact phrasing from Matthew chapter 26, when Jesus says, as he's instituting the Lord's Supper, communion, he says, this cup is the blood of the covenant. Same exact phrase from the Greek Old Testament, the Septuagint, right into Matthew's record of what Jesus had to say. So it's the hyssop and the sprinkling, like it's all interweaved.
And they don't really... that's the bad thing about Hollywood when they do Bible stories is you get these pictures in your head, and you can't get rid of them, and they're not necessarily right.
Not all of them, And some of them have done really well, and some of them are. Yeah, I love that. I love that we get some imagery and you get to picture it more. But and we learn.
Right.
We've learned a lot more since when was the Ten Commandments made?
60s.
Yeah, in the 60s.
Early 60s.
Because we've actually learned so much about the Old Testament since then with the discovery of the Dead Sea Scrolls and a lot of that Second Temple literature that we pulled out of there, understanding how the Hebrews understood the Old Testament, all of their translation and commentary on the Old Testament that we have access to now. The first century, Hebrews. And so it's been, we know more. We know more. And there's
the thing, Koine Greek is a dead language, so we pieced it together. But I love it. Was it in the 70s, 80s? They found in a trash pile, they found little scripts and receipts from some shop. And the exact phrase, when Jesus said it is finished, that's what they would stamp on receipts, paid in full.
Oh, yeah. Like first century receipts.
First century receipts, they'd write on there. It means it's paid in full.
Yep.
Not it's finished. So we've translated as it is finished to where that the use in his time was paid in full.
It's test a lot. I remember that the word is significant, but I'm losing it at the moment. But
yeah. So the things we learned, it keeps bringing up. When people are trying to say, well, that's a myth, it never happened, all this stuff, and more evidence keeps coming up.
Yeah.
just justifying and go, no, everything we,
Yeah, and it helps us understand that word too.
Right.
You know, like that's to grab onto the ideas that, you know, how it was used in their day.
Right.
You know, because we use phrases all the time that
you're killing me.
Yeah. It's like, not really.
Not really. Yeah.
But if you read that completely like out of context, you know, in a very literal sense, it makes something different. I heard this joke. I don't even know if I'm supposed to say this, you know, for a DCC podcast. But one of the things it said was, in 1,000 years, if somebody's reading our literature, they might not know the difference between a booty call and a butt dial, and that's why it's hard to understand the Bible sometimes.
Yeah,
because it's
idioms and
language and even not even idioms, it's just how it was used in that moment or that context or that time period. Makes it difficult sometimes. So it just takes time and study and connection and understanding and what we have is we have so much good work that's been done on it too. You know, we have good tools and things like that to be able to access instantly, even for free. You know, the ability to look at language connections and original languages. Even if you don't.
A lot of this stuff, you know, I tried doing when I was younger. And, you know, I grew up without internet. You know, if you didn't know, you went to the library. If they didn't have it, you asked somebody you knew. And
did you take notes on stone tablets too?
No. We had the wax boards.
Oh, you had the wax boards. Okay.
So, but you know, you looked in a library, you talked to some people, and that was the end of it.
Right.
There wasn't any place else to go. Right. So, you know, you'd look in the concordance in the back, and, you know, when you're dealing with King James, and there were no translator's notes. I mean, I loved when the Net Bible came out. It was the most accurate translation, but more importantly, they had the notes at the bottom. I mean, the top quarter of the page is the scripture, and the other 3/4 is explanation of why they used the words they used and what, you know, transcripts it came from. And if it's like, this is not a unanimous decision, you know, some scholars say this, and it's all in there. So you can look at it and go, okay, and understand. Rather than, you know, we have, you know, how many words for different things in English, and they're slightly different.
Well, that's the example I was thinking of. If you were to say, you know, just do a Google search of all of the instances of the word love in the New Testament. In the English, you're not going to quite get the flavor because in the Greek,
but there's 7.
Well, there's 4 that are used in the New Testament. You know, 4 different words for love. You know, there's the romantic love, eros. There's the brotherly kind of fellowship love, phileo, and I'm missing one. But then agape is, of course, that kind of unconditional, self-sacrificial love. Yeah, but it's true. Yeah, and they tell you what kind of love it is. You know? So what I'm trying to say is, with the tools we have today, we can then go, okay, let's not find all the instances of the English word where we translate it, but let's find all the instances of how this word is used in the original language. And you can do that whether you understand or know the Greek or not, you know, which is great because, you know, I was showing Shaun one of my favorite online Bible sites is blueletterbible.org, and you can just click in and you can see, okay, here's the Hebrew word or here's the Greek word that's used there, and then you can click and see all of the instances where that word's used elsewhere. It gives you a fuller context, and sometimes it's just a word that you even like don't think it's very significant, but you know, as I was studying the text on Sunday to share, where Jesus is like, the greatest commandment is love God with all your heart, soul, mind, and the second is like it. That word like, all throughout the book of Matthew, only was used to talk about parables. Like the kingdom of heaven is like, and so it just kind of gives that
direct analogy.
Exactly, that nuance where Jesus is basically saying, love God, and you're going to show that in a parabolic way to the world by loving your neighbor. And so, yeah, those language things, but you don't have to know Greek or Hebrew to use those tools. You just have to take some time, and it takes a little practice. You know.
Yeah, it does. I mean, I don't speak Greek. I don't speak
I don't
Hebrew.
either.
So, you know, but I understand how to do research and comparisons, and you look at what the word is and how it's used and where it's used somewhere else. And especially, you know, when you look at the English translation, a lot of them don't line up. It's like this is not what it was said, but it's as close as we can get.
Yep, and it's because it's a different language.
Right.
We have a different language.
And it's not just different; it's a different culture too.
It's a different language, different culture. Yeah.
So even if you get the words right, sometimes you still don't get the meaning.
Yeah, and you kind of miss it because you have to. I word it like you have to put on your first century glasses.
Right.
You have to put on you got to look through it with Jewish lenses.
Right.
In some ways, and absolutely.
Yeah. So we look at the Passover.
I was about to say, let's get back on track. You got it.
So we look at the Passover, and then we have the Lord's Supper.
Yes.
And I've always taken the Passover as part of the Lord's Supper, and it's not.
No.
So you have to understand it. It's separate from either observing the Passover.
Yes.
Then he instituted the Lord's Supper, but it's not a supper; it's a covenant.
Yes.
And then I never understood that because I understood the covenant where you take the animal and you tear it up in a big mess and you walk through and here's what I'm going to do and here you walk through and it's
that's one kind of covenant.
That's one kind, right? That was the one I was taught. That's what I didn't understand. There were more. There's like 6 different types of covenants.
Yeah.
So you had the one where you'd walk through and and basically it was like if I break my covenant, then the Lord do this to me.
Yes. Yeah.
It was like make a mess out of me. So. But the other one was they had a meal covenant. And a meal covenant was celebrated by eating bread and drinking wine.
Yes.
And that was a covenant. So that was the thing. Because, when you go through and goes, well, this is my body. It's like, we don't
right.
eat people. So that doesn't really make sense.
Yep.
And then this is my blood. And you're like, well, you definitely don't drink blood because that's specifically prescribed in the Old Testament. You will not drink any blood.
Right.
You drain the blood out of everything.
And repeated in the New Testament as well.
And it's repeated in the New Testament, right.
Yeah.
So we were told over and over again not to do this, and Christ does this. You're like, so it doesn't make sense.
Yeah.
But it's symbolic, which we understood as symbolic. We kind of, okay, obviously it's symbolic, but we didn't understand why.
Right.
And then when you understand, he instituted a meal covenant.
Yes.
And then when you look at the type of covenant, it's like the Noahic covenant. And it's not for us to remember that he did it. It's for us to remind God
interesting.
that he made the covenant.
Right. Well, which is something that this is something that some people get uncomfortable with.
Yeah.
They're like, we don't need to remind God of anything, and it's not that he forgot.
Right.
Right. Like we're not saying that, but read through your Old Testament.
Right.
Right. Like God, we're in Exodus. It's not far where God's going to be like, Moses, I'm ready to destroy these people. Look at them worshiping that golden calf. Moses goes, whoa, Lord, remember your covenant with your people, right? Yeah. So it's not reminding him because he's forgotten. It's kind of just it does something for us in that spot too, because it reminds us of the covenant we're in with God as well. But I like that kind of perspective there.
Yeah, and then the phrase he uses, this do in remembrance of me, and we're like, okay, yeah, Christ died, we remember that, but we in English remember is like you remember your anniversary, right? I remember the date, okay, but in the Greek, the word they use here is remembrance. It's a deep dive where you go back, and it was like you would remember when you met your wife and you took her out, and the courting and all of this, and your marriage. You remember all of this, and you bring it back up.
Yes.
And that's what the remembrance is.
Right.
So when it says to do this in remembrance, it's not like Christ died for me. Okay, thanks. Well, no, it's a stop and remember what all he's done, and how he got here,
and maybe even just that whole biblical narrative of it, right? With sin enters the world, now we need a savior to crush the serpent's head, and we get pictures and glimmers of what that's going to look like throughout when we see Abraham and his son on the mountain, and we see the people of Israel offering sacrifices, and we are looking forward to in Isaiah the suffering servant, and then Jesus came and he died and he rose again, and he promised that one of these days he's returning. Like it's this remembering, because one of the things that I've learned over the last couple of years, that especially in the Hebrew, which kind of is the basis for everything, even our Greek New Testament, remembering and forgetting are active terms. We think of forgetting as something passive, like oops, I forgot. But usually how forgetting is used in the Old Testament is that it's this active ignoring. It's this active forgetting. It's this choosing not to remember, not to focus, not to put our heart into it.
It's not the full, because we can't, if you actively do it, you obviously are bringing it up, but you're going, I'm not, that's not
Right. I'm gonna forget him. Yeah. I'm gonna do something else. Like
Right,
it's an active thing that we choose to do versus it. We usually, when we say, "Oh, I forgot something," it was this passive thing.
Yeah, and the thing I found interesting is, the remembrance is this deep study,
Mm-hmm.
and Paul brings it up in Corinthians. He says, "Don't take in an unworthy man. Examine yourself."
Right.
Right.
Oh, just like the Passover lamb was examined, we're called as we come to partake of that Passover lamb again.
You just don't take a hit and go. No, we're to examine ourselves and take this in a worthy manner. So it's just, I never put the two together.
Mm-hmm.
When he said that Paul's talking about this in Corinthians, that we're to, before we partake of it. If you have aught against anyone, go out and take care of that before you come to the table.
Yeah.
Right? And then we're to examine ourselves.
Yeah.
And take it in a worthy manner.
Right. And what's amazing is, what is a worthy manner? It's a manner that is completely trusting in Jesus, right? Like is our life in that place? Because we can't be worthy on our own, right? Like there's no earning that worth. Even after we're in Christ, we don't earn our worth ever. It's all given from Him. And so the unworthy manner is going to be when we're trusting in our own selves. And I know that the Corinthians were pretty well, as Paul's writing to them about that. They were known for kind of just giving into their own ideas about how they wanted to do things, whether it was with spiritual gifts and the church and using it for selfish gain, or some of their sexual immorality that they just went full bore into. They weren't trusting Christ and what He was doing and His idea and His plan, and that would make them unworthy. Not that they could earn their worth on their own, but that Christ would make them worthy. And it's a complete focus and faith on Him. Back to that remembrance.
Yeah. So I just thought that was, to separate those out, that, this is a covenant meal, and they are symbols, but they're not symbols in the way I understood them.
Right. What I love is, and this is something that I think we overlook sometimes, is back in Exodus when Moses presents the law to the people, like we've talked about already a little bit, Exodus 24, and basically says, "Hey, here's the law," and the people go, "Everything the Lord said to obey," so they offer that sacrifice, right? This is covenant, right? And Moses says this, and he sprinkles them. He says, "This is the blood of the covenant." Same language,
right?
But do you know what happens exactly right after that? Exodus 24? This is what happens. I'll tell you. It says, "So then Moses, Aaron, Nadab, and Abihu, and the 70 elders of Israel," so like a representation of the people of Israel, their leaders, they saw the God of Israel. Like they get this. They get to see Him at some level, obviously probably not all in His glory, but this is what it says. They saw Him. There was under His feet, as it were, a pavement of sapphire stone, like the very heaven for clearness. But He did not lay His hand on the chief men of the people of Israel. They beheld God and ate and drank. The 70 elders go up on the mountain after the blood of the covenant. They see God. They eat and drink. We have the disciples come into the upper room. Jesus says, "This is the blood of the covenant." They look up, and the one handing them the cup, they see God, and then they eat and drink. Like there's another cool meal covenant connection there.
Yeah.
That's Exodus chapter 24.
And it's the same thing. When you look at it, Jesus broke bread and gave it to them, said, "Take and eat," and He gave them the cup. He didn't eat.
It doesn't say He ate.
He didn't. No, He gave it to them.
Yeah.
To eat. He gave it to them to drink.
The cup. Gave it to them. Yeah. Yeah. He doesn't need to partake of His own sacrifice. No. He doesn't need to partake of His own body and blood. No. It's His gift to us. Yeah.
So I was just, I mean, when I started trying to figure that out, it was just amazing how deep you go. Yeah. To get through all the different things that.
There's so much there. I was telling Shaun before we turned the camera on that there's so many Old Testament connections One of them that also connects to the Passion Week is from Zechariah chapter 9. Now, we usually read Zechariah chapter 9 on Palm Sunday because it talks about how rejoice greatly, daughter of Zion, shout aloud, O daughter of Jerusalem. This is verse 9, Zechariah 9:9. Behold, your king is coming to you, righteous and having salvation, he humble and mounted on a donkey, right? Like, so we get the donkey prediction that he's going to ride in on the donkey. But like immediately following it, he says, and as for you also, because of the blood of my covenant with you, I will set your prisoners free from the waterless pit. He is connecting. Okay, so Passion Week starts with him coming in on the donkey, and then we got blood of the covenant. Again, same exact phrase, Exodus 24, same phrase as Matthew 26. It is, so he's saying, and what that blood of the covenant does sets you free. It sets you free from the waterless pit. Same word actually used with Joseph and his brothers. They put him into a waterless pit, but God comes and frees you from the pit. Which is, it's all connected.
Well, and then, I forget, I like this one part about the lamb. When they prepared the lamb, they slaughtered it.
Yes.
They drained the blood from it, and they roasted it.
Roasted it. Can't boil it. Can't eat it raw. Can't boil it with water.
Right. They just roasted it. They didn't gut it. They didn't hide it.
Yeah.
They didn't. And you're not to break any bones.
Yes.
Right. And you look at Christ on the cross. He was bled.
Yep.
He died. He was punctured.
Yep.
No bones were broken.
Right.
And just.
Yeah, and it's in one of the New Testament gospel writers, I think it's Matthew, even notes that as a fulfillment of prophecy.
Yeah.
So I'm not.
And it's interesting. It's specified that's how you're to kill your lamb.
Right.
Not to break any bones. You're supposed to roast it whole.
Right.
Not supposed to do anything else to it.
Mm-hmm.
Which, it's a very strange way to cook.
Yeah. Yeah, because they came to the cross and they wanted to break the bones so that they could be done with the crucifixion.
Right. Because that evening was the start of the Sabbath and they couldn't have him hanging on a tree.
Yeah, and they came to Jesus, but he was already dead, so they didn't have to break his bones. Yeah. So awesome. What else?
I think that's. I don't know.
Sorry,
I know.
I'm not trying to be here. We've been kind of we've been having fun, just kind of like moseying along through it.
Yeah, I think that's about it. I just kind of bounced around, but
yeah,
that was the thing. Starting out with just why is it bread and blood? It's way more than that. You have to go all the way back to Exodus to understand.
Right.
The Last Supper.
Yeah, absolutely. And in some senses, you even go all the way back to the garden.
Yeah.
Right? Like, what happens when sin comes into the world? It's not explicitly spelled out for us, but, Adam and Eve in the garden, they sin, of course, and then the Lord comes and walking in the garden, the cool of the day, and he says, "Where are you?" And then when they are found, they're like, "Well, we hid because we were naked." And who told you we were naked? And they go through that whole thing. But what happens? It says, "And then the Lord provided the skins of an animal to clothe them." Well, how do you get the skins of an animal?
Yep.
Maybe the first sacrifice. That's a lot of interpreters have seen that throughout the whole history. And of course, we have the promise of Jesus, the Messiah, being the snakehead crusher.
Yeah.
So serpent, snake.
Yeah, there's a lot of holes in Genesis. It's just like, Cain and Abel offered their sacrifice, and Abel's was good and Cain's was bad. According to what?
Right.
Yeah, it's like nobody said what. There was no. This is what you're told to do.
Right.
But apparently they knew.
Mm-hmm.
So, it didn't get related.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah, and there's so much. It's. They're stories with a purpose, right? Like they tell us something, but don't tell us everything. Yeah. And I love one of the ideas that's been presented to me more recently that I think has a lot of merit is this picture that the Torah, the first 5 books of the Bible, and maybe even more specifically, like Genesis 1 through 3, kind of encapsulates the whole story of the Bible, and everything else that comes after that is kind of divine divinely inspired commentary and expansion on it. And you can trace everything back to the garden, and that everything can go trace forward from the garden as well. And so we get the story of Cain and Abel and how sin gets to work in our heart, but it doesn't explain everything. We don't explain all the motives and those ideas, but just fast forward, keep fasting forward, and you come to the ministry of Jesus, and he gets it to, hey, you might be following the letter of the law. Cain offered a sacrifice, but your heart's in the wrong place. Your motives are in the wrong place, and so it's not what I wanted. I want your heart. I want everything you are. So you kind of just trace it forward, and you begin to understand. Then you can look backwards and understand it a little bit more. Whether we can know for sure that's exactly what was going on with Cain and Abel, we can understand that's what can happen with us.
And you get the example of the Jews, all through the Old Testament, where they became very legalistic, and it wasn't about serving God; it was about checking it. And then. I was thinking about that. You talk about, how do I know I'm saved in the Old Testament?
Yeah.
Right? I thought about it. Nowhere in there does it say where the bar is.
Yeah.
Right? And it's like you follow the law, you make your sacrifices, you serve God. What's enough?
Right.
And for a very legalistic culture, that would have been a huge question.
Well, and because they got things backwards.
Right.
Because when you look at specifically the book of Exodus, God's words are when he brings them out of Egypt before the law, right? When he brings them out of Egypt, he says, I have saved you. I have rescued you. You're now my people, and here's my law. So it's a reflection of exactly where we're at with the Christian faith. We're not out there earning our salvation. It's a gift through Jesus and his sacrifice. And the people of Israel didn't earn their salvation by following the law. It was a gift from God as he rescued them from Egypt. And he said, and if you're going to be covenant partners with me, here's how you live. Here's what the community looks like. And it's not that they got to earn it by doing the sacrifices. It's not, but they, of course, they got to the following the law became more important than the God who saved them in many ways, and that was Jesus's, and it became
it's kind of a checklist mentality.
A checklist mentality, and also then we get power brokers into the religion too, where these religious leaders got to control how everybody else followed the law, and then they didn't want to lose it. That was one of the big reasons they came after Jesus, is because he was this new rabbi on the scene who was challenging their authority, and they didn't like it. In fact, our text for this next Sunday is from Matthew chapter 23, where he really lays into them. But yeah, absolutely. I love all of it. Cool. Yeah.
Yeah, I don't know.
You got anything else to share?
I think I've got, that's about all I've got.
All right. Well, guys, if you tuned in for this whole time, thanks for joining us. Shaun, thank you for taking some time to sit down and talk through something. Here's what I'll say. Drop some comments or questions. If you know Shaun or I, you can send it to us directly. But if you put it on our YouTube page, we'll pass it along. And if there's enough of something to do a follow-up, we'll do a follow-up. If there's just a simple response, we'll put it right in the text of the comments. But DCCers, if you're interested in sitting down and have a conversation about some kind of topic from the Bible or theology or spirituality or any of that, I'd love to sit down and have a conversation with you as well. But until next time. Thanks, Shaun, for being here. And thanks, guys, for joining us. See you next time.